Okay, it is 3 o'clock Eastern. We have a lot of great content to get through, so we're going to get started right on the dot. I'm sure people will be joining throughout the hour. But again, my name is David Dodge. I'm the executive editor of Gays with Kids. And you are joining our webinar on navigating surrogacy as a single gay man. So we're very excited to be joined by Dr. Jenny Hirshfeld-Cytron of the Fertility Centers of Illinois and Sam Hyde of Surrogacy. I'll be turning it over to them in just a second, but just by way of explanation. So this is now, I think, our sixth webinar on the topic of surrogacy. These are new resources that we're very excited to be rolling out at Gays with Kids. We started about 6 years ago, and over that time, we've had a lot of people kind of reaching out to us who may have known us best from our very popular Instagram page, which features adorable photos of queer men and their children, or from our website, which has family profiles of different gay, bi, and trans men that have become fathers. But something we kept hearing from our audience is that people wanted more resources. They wanted to know how to navigate the very complicated paths to parenthood that are available to queer men, surrogacy being one of them, but also adoption, foster care. These are not easy things to navigate, as you know, or you wouldn't be on this webinar. So we have spent the last year really trying to buckle down and come up with the best way to be getting these resources out to our audience, people that want help navigating the system, everything from making the decision as what best path is right for you, down to the decision point where you choose an adoption agency or surrogacy agency or fertility clinic. So we're very excited to have been rolling this out over the last 3 or 4 months, and very excited to be partnered with two of the experts you see here, among others, who all have a long track record of success in working with the LGBTQ community and helping them become fathers. So with that, I'm going to very quickly introduce our webinar speakers and then turn it over to them. Just how this will operate is we'll spend about 30 minutes going through first a very quick overview of surrogacy and IVF, which again are complicated processes, just to give people some context as to how it functions generally. And then we'll spend the latter part of the presentation talking through tips, resources, and other things that you should be thinking about if you're single and wanting to navigate these processes on your own. We're going to save a good 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. And as you have them, if you're hearing, as you're hearing our panelists speak, if you have a question that comes up, please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen if you're joining us on Zoom. If you're on YouTube, you can be typing the questions into the comment section there. We'll be monitoring those. And we'll get through as many of those as possible. Again, this is a complicated topic, so we'll try to get through as many of the questions as we can. For those that we're unable to answer, we're asking people to email us at dads@gayswithkids.com. I'll repeat that several times throughout the presentation. And we will make sure that we follow up with you if we're not able to get to your specific question, or if we're not able to answer it as fully as you would like us to. So with that, I'm very excited to, again, turn it over to our speakers. So again, we are joined by Sam Hyde of Surrogacy and Dr. Jenny E. Hirshfeld-Cytron of the Fertility Centers of Illinois, again, who both have a lot of expertise in working with LGBTQ people and helping them navigate the process of surrogacy and IVF. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to start us on our overview of surrogacy journeys.
Of course, I start on mute in classic Zoom fashion. I think we're all used to that now, halfway through 2020. So, David, thanks so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Great to meet everybody on the webinar here, and excited to spend some time together today. I find these often go best when we can move through the content in a fairly brisk pace and then spend a lot of time with Q&A, because everybody's situation is slightly different. And so let's start with just a broad overview of how a surrogacy journey typically unfolds. And as David, I think, mentioned a couple times, these journeys are fairly complicated and fairly long. And so there's a lot of kind of ins and outs and what have yous here. And also I'll try to touch on the high points for us as we go through. So at the beginning of the process, you can actually think of a bubble to the left of one that I would kind of call bubble 0, which is really select the providers and the partners you want to have in this journey. And for a general surrogacy journey, you're going to need 3 key partners. So the first is a surrogacy agency who will help you find your surrogate. The second is an egg donor agency who will help you find your egg donor. Circle actually does both of those, so we're the one and the same. And then the third is a great IVF clinic like FCI. Some IVF clinics have egg donors as well, so you can either get the egg donor from the clinic, the agent, or the surrogacy agency, or perhaps even a third party that you might know in your own lives. And so step 0 is really identifying who the partners you're going to ride with through this whole journey are going to be. And then we kind of move over into the step 1, which is really around embryo creation and then matching with your carrier. So most established surrogacy agencies in the country that have had a long track record of success for parents do have very stringent criteria for bringing surrogates into their program. And because of that, they often have a wait list associated with finding a great surrogate. Circle, for instance, we only accept about 1.5% of the women that apply to our agency. And because of that, right now we have about a 5-month wait to match with a carrier. And so most parents will choose to sign on with a surrogacy agency and then actually do the embryo creation itself after they sign on with that agency. So you'd sign on with an agency, you'd get on the wait list to find a great surrogate, and then while you're on that wait list, identify a donor that you really love. And you can select a donor based on any number of different criteria out there. This is a very personal decision for you and your family in terms of what you're looking for. But the agency, coupled with your IVF clinic that you've already chosen, will help you walk through that embryo creation process. You, of course, will need to provide a bit of your own biology in this. And so you'll need to travel at this time to the clinic to provide your sample. In conjunction, the egg donor will travel to the clinic usually 2 times, first for a screening, and then second to do the egg retrieval itself, at which point the doctor will create the embryos for you. And I know Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron will talk about that in just a moment at a little bit more depth. Once you have your embryos, then you're probably just about ready to start the matching process with the surrogate. Embryo creation, in our experience, from the time you start to look for a donor to the time you have embryos in hand, usually takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 months, depending on how kind of quickly you want to move things along. We'll help you match with a great carrier at the kind of the end of this first bubble. And we can talk about what screening and matching looks like on the next page. It's a very complex process that we'll walk you through. But then once you're matched, you'll move into really the meat of the journey. And there's a couple things that happen in this stage too. It's primarily a medical process, but there's some foundational work we need to do before we get to the actual medicine itself. Primarily, we're going to need to draw up a legal contract between you and your surrogate to guide us through the remainder of this journey. And so if you're with an agency like Circle, we have all of our lawyers in-house. We'll represent you as it relates to that carrier agreement. If you're with a smaller surrogacy agency that maybe doesn't have as much experience, you might have to go outside to find a lawyer to help you through that portion. But first off, we drop the legal agreement. We all sign the legal agreement, or rather you and the carrier sign the legal agreement, and then we help coordinate that cycle, that transfer cycle, where your surrogate will travel to the clinic. Again, usually 2 times, first time for an in-person physical, second time to do the embryo transfer itself. That stage between when you match and when you get to transfer usually takes about 3 months or so, maybe 4 months, to make sure we got the legal agreement signed, drafted, surrogate screening completed, and then travel for the embryo transfer. Most clinics are going to have a success rate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% plus for that first transfer. This is, we're really creating an ideal environment here using a donor egg plus transferring that into a surrogate with established fertility. And so, more times than not, you'll come out of that first transfer with a successful pregnancy. Again, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron can talk about that in a moment. But then obviously bubble 3 here, the pregnancy is ideally going to be 9 months. The good agencies in the country, our support does not stop once you're pregnant. If anything, that support becomes even more important. And we really take a 2-prong approach here during the journey. One, working with our intended parents to make sure that we have that you're supported, that you understand the processes that are coming up, that you're prepared for the birth of your child, and that your legal environment is well secured, such that when that baby is born, your name and only your name will be the one on the birth certificate. And then secondarily, Circle also spends a lot of time supporting your surrogate during the journey. And so we have licensed social workers in-house that will talk to your surrogate on a very regular basis to make sure that she feels supported during the journey. And that often allows us to solve any type of small frictional issues behind the scenes, because the surrogate can talk to her social worker at Circle, you can talk to your case manager at Circle, and then behind the scenes we can help kind of solve any issues that might be out there. And then that line goes up into the air because you're really heading into the unknown here once the baby is born. I think nothing in this world can prepare you for being a parent. I've gone through the process now 3 times with my own 3 kids, and it is, nothing can prepare you for holding that child. We'll try, and what we really try to do is kind of tie a bow on everything for you at the end. So we'll make sure all the legal work is handled, we'll make sure all the medical bills are processed, and then we'll be checking with you and your surrogate regularly after birth to make sure everyone feels well supported. So your average journey is going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 months, just depending on kind of how quickly you move through some of the stages. Some of those stages, are going to be guided just by, the wait time that's inherent in the process, like pregnancy. We can't speed that up. Some of the other things are going to be guided by how fast you make choices in terms of selecting an egg donor, in terms of selecting your surrogate once we start to present profiles to you, and then also just kind of how fast you want to move in general. But you should orient probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 18 months for a journey, which means if you started today, we're probably looking at having a baby in spring of 2022, which is very exciting. So hopefully that's a good overview. We can obviously go into much more detail on a formal consult.
Great.
So great, let's talk about probably one of the most important factors when it comes to a surrogacy journey, which is matching with a great carrier. I think everybody has in their mind an idea of what type of carrier they want to match with, what type of relationship they want to have with that carrier. And this relationship and this journey can take a lot of different forms. And for Circle, we really look for you guys to tell us what you're looking for out of a carrier as it relates to personality, relationship, kind of desire for regular communication both during the pregnancy and after. And so we'll really look to you guys to guide us on some of those elements. But before we get to that stage, there's a robust amount of screening that has to occur on this carrier to make sure that she's a suitable candidate for your journey. Now, there's kind of 2 schools of thought out there with regard to surrogate screening. Most small agencies, or most agencies that don't have a lot of experience, will do a very perfunctory level of screening on a surrogate. And then once you're matched with her, they'll put her through the remainder of that screening. Over time at Circle, we've realized that limits objectivity in the process. It also leads to more match breaks where parents need to match with a new surrogate. And so we've taken the tack that we should only present parents with fully screened carriers. And so on an average month, we'll have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 women start the application process with us. And over the course of our screening process, we'll whittle that down to about 25 to 35, which is where I get that about 1.5% acceptance rate. And so our surrogates will go through about a 250 question application. We will do criminal and financial background checks on the surrogate and any adults in her household, which is very key. Most agencies, unfortunately, do not do that second piece. We will collect all the medical records associated with her previous pregnancies. We will share that. We will review that ourselves, but then we'll also share that with your doctor so that they can review before a match. We'll collect any of her insurance information so we know what insurance environment to put in place for her maternity care. And then finally, we'll put her through a robust psychological screening that takes 2 forms. The first is one of our licensed social workers in-house will put her through a very long kind of form call like we're doing now, video call, where we'll talk through family history, medical history, motivations for doing this, and also trying to assess kind of this amorphous, what type of support does she have in her life. Independently, we'll also do a call with her primary support person. Usually that's her husband or partner, to make sure that they're also aligned with going through a journey. We really want to make sure we have familial alignment there. And then we'll also secondarily put her through what is called a PAI test. which is essentially a personality battery, the SATs for your personality, if you will. And then we have that graded by a psychologist here in Boston. So only after we do all of those steps do we feel comfortable saying someone is, a circle surrogate, so to speak. And then only then will we then present her for matching with you. And then when we present her for matching, we start to look at some of these secondary qualities, some of these things that you've asked us to look for in a carrier with regard to personality, communication style, desired relationship. There's a timing element in there as well. Some parents want to move faster or slower than the surrogates want to move. And then finally, of course, the legal fit. We would only ever match you in a state in which we know we can do the legal work for your specific situation. The legal work is always guided by two factors. One, the state in which the baby is going to be born, and then secondarily, the state or country in which the intended parents reside full-time. That's particularly important for our international parents that come to the US to do surrogacy, where each international country has a different kind of scheme for establishing parentage when you get home, and we need to match you with a surrogate in a state in which is conducive to that particular fit. So a lot to think about, and what we think about really is putting together a big puzzle. And so we have our surrogates coming in on this side, 25 to 35 puzzle pieces per month on this side, our parents coming in on this side, about the same number. And how do we put this puzzle together such that we can give both the surrogates and the parents exactly what they want? And we're quite good at it. So it's a fun part of the journey, and a fun part for parents too, I think, when we get to go through that matching process with you.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. So again, I'll just invite people that are listening, if you've joined us a little bit late, but if you have any questions about anything that you're hearing, feel free to ask them at any point during using the Q&A function on Zoom at the top or bottom of your screen, or if you're watching via Facebook Live, you can type them into the comments, and we'll get through as many of those as we can towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron, who's going to walk us through the IVF portion of your surrogacy journey.
That's it. Thank you so much for having us come. My name is Jenny Hirshfeld-Cytron. It has been said, I'm with Fertility Centers of Illinois, and it's really an honor to be here and to be discussing this. To get into the meat of sort of what Sam had alluded to in terms of the medical process, which is really providing an overview of IVF, which is the same regardless if a single or gay man is doing this, or a female, or two females, or however sort of combination in the context of the treatments that are done. And so in terms of the IVF piece of it. In terms of selection of the egg donor, if we sort of start with that part of it, an egg donor can be done, as was discussed, in the context of an agency. Most fertility practices have our own in-house donors, which have the advantage of already being screened by us before they're allotted to be utilized, when we have experience in that context. The other sort of way to think of an egg donor is an egg bank. And so now more and more couples are utilizing egg banks simply for the fact that an egg bank is an individual who's already done the IVF process, which has already done the 10 days of injection-based medications, a retrieval where those eggs are extracted. This occurs on average for a woman in her 20s, so somewhere in the vicinity of 15 plus eggs are obtained, and then those would be fertilized. An egg bank provides a way to sort of break down this process, so that's already occurred. Those 15 plus eggs are grouped in sort of 3 groups, let's say groups of some are 5 plus, and you can purchase a group or cohort of those eggs. The advantage of this approach to be considered is simply it's already done, so it's faster in terms of that month time period that was sort of discussed. It also, most egg banks, and one we've partnered with, is a national egg bank. So the advantage being the diversity of those within that pool are just going to be greater, period. Women from coast to coast have already participated. So it's a sort of another way of thinking about choosing that egg donor, either the live donor, so to speak, or someone who's been a part of the egg bank. The next piece as we sort of build is to conduct a semen analysis. And so in that vein, what we want to make sure is that if there's any issues with the sperm, we know this way before an individual chooses an egg donor. If there's an issue, the majority of issues for men can be resolved. And so when we think of the differences biologically, sperm regenerates every 3 months. Contrastly, women are born with the fixed number of eggs. That's why we're choosing egg donors in their 20s. But because sperm regenerates every 3 months, certain behaviors that can negatively impact sperm, whether it's testosterone use or certain other colds or viruses simply can impact sperm temporarily. Things like cannabis use. If those things are stopped 3 months later, we can see a vast improvement. So the goal is that we know all of our components, all of our pieces way before, so that we can plan if we need to make any adjustments. For two men who are undergoing in this process, it is important to remember that we combine 1 egg per sperm. And so what can be considered is to split. So in those cases, whether it's 15 eggs or it's 7 eggs, it can be split so that each member of the partnership can sort of have delineated which embryos sort of are biologically connected. Or it could be one individual. It is unable, though, to just sort of place them together and to not sort of do this more directed. The next piece is to decide which sperm to use. And so most couples that I work with, there is an inherent desire to sort of split. That way there's the option either within that same surrogate in the context of twins, which we'll sort of review as something that we're pushing away from as a field, just because twins carry their own risk medically in terms of the health of the child, the children, the health of the mother, or to think of your whole family. Child A, we're going to be utilizing this sperm. Child B will be utilizing that sperm. And the egg and sperm that are combined are tracked. So we will know each embryo that's created, what was the sperm that was utilized. The next thing that we think then is creation of the embryo. So if egg and sperm are fertilized, 5 days later, we create a blast shape embryo. So a blast, by definition, is an embryo where there's been so many cell divisions, you can no longer count the different cells that create the components. The day 5 or blast embryo has really become the embryo phase at which we want to transfer. Not every egg that's fertilized makes it to that day 5 phase, and that's why it's so key. It's an initial piece of selection. So if on average we have 15 eggs that are fertilized, probably somewhere 10 to 12 successfully fertilized, probably somewhere half of that, even a little bit less, 40 to 50% become embryos. So you can start with 15 eggs and you can end up with 4 embryos. I know it always feels like what happened, that is the expectation. So walking into know, okay, we're gonna end up with 4 embryos, we place 1 per try, we have that 60 to 70% success, but we have an idea ahead of time what to anticipate. In addition to allowing the embryos to sort of self-select in terms of which make it to the blast phase, we can do a biopsy of a day 5 embryo and we can learn the genetics of the embryo. That is the way that we can learn gender, if that is something that is a priority. It's also a way we can screen for chromosome abnormalities. So in the way beginning, when you choose an egg donor, the individual who's providing the sperm source will undergo genetic testing. Genetic testing for what's called carrier illnesses, which is the idea that if our DNA is like a 700-page book, 2 letters got confused. So if someone's a carrier of cystic fibrosis or someone's a carrier of sickle cell, being a carrier has 0 impact on your health, but we want the 2 genetic components of the embryos to not be carriers of the same thing. So knowing what the individual's a carrier for, knowing that donor has been extensively screened genetically, allows you to best choose the most appropriate genetic match. That's one of the pieces when you choose the egg donor. Fast forward now to when the embryo is created, unrelated to sort of the actual letters of our 700-page book of DNA, is the idea that there's book chapters. And this piece I always think of when egg and sperm come together, when fertilization comes together, it's like 2 Harry Potter books are becoming 1. 2 of those huge 700-page books have become 1, and mistakes can happen. And those chromosomes have to duplicate themselves as occur in egg and sperm, and then divide down, which happens at the level of the embryo. And those mistakes can result in things like a miscarriage, or they can result in things like Down syndrome. And although the age of the individual, the age of that egg donor is what dictates those risks, is low, it's not 0. And so some of the advantages of embryo testing is another element. Very frank, it's not necessarily that it's improving pregnancy success, because 65 to 70 is really the ceiling. It helps to minimize the miscarriage rate, which of course is key in choosing the best embryo. And so from sort of start of choosing the egg donor, all the way to choosing, going through the process of identifying a genetically normal embryo, is sort of what the medical piece of it, what occurs within the context of the IVF lab at the clinic that you choose.
Great, thank you so much. So again, that was a very quick overview of a very complicated process from 2 experts. So again, if you have any questions about that, you're not alone. And feel free again to use our Q&A function to be asking them of our experts. It can be on the topic of surrogacy for single queer men or any other topic that is of interest to you on either how to navigate surrogacy or IVF. And this next section, because this webinar really is dedicated to single queer people who are interested in pursuing this process. And honestly, we decided to do this particular webinar because we do get such, there's a lot of single queer men who are asking these questions now. It's one of the top questions we get asked at Gays with Kids. So we're very excited to both, I think, emphasize, as we just did in this in the first portion of this webinar, that the process is very similar depending, regardless of whether you're in a relationship or not. But that said, there are particular concerns that you should be thinking through if you are single, and we're gonna walk through those right now. And so I'm forgetting who we gave this slide to. Is this you, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron? Okay. Okay, take it.
So very well said. Some of the pros, as you said, there's no need to wait in terms of starting the process, but I think Sam has identified so well that there still is this, the wait I always think of as like the rate limiting step is identifying the gestational carrier. Out of everything, that's what's going to take the longest. So it's nice, as was said so well, is to start there. So no need to wait. There's no need to wait to initiate, but there will be a little bit of wait in identifying that gestational carrier. Without question, we're all seeing an increased number of men pursuing surrogacy. That is the pros. Cons in this is cost, is always, I think, no question. This is a costly venture, so having an appreciation and having an entity like Gays with Kids, I think like anything else in life, the more you know before you start, the better, so as you can plan. And potentially experiencing the process alone can be challenging, just given all these components. Many couples will share with me, many single men will share with me, it feels like a full-time job on top of my full-time job. So it's nice to know you're not doing this alone. Theoretically, there may be some limit to potential matches. There could potentially be some legal issues for single in terms of the international piece for independent parents. I think that's where what was said already is so key. So when you identify and you're working with a reproductive attorney, again, this happens even before you've chosen gestational carrier. You know, these are not unknowns. People with experience in this, these are very well established in every country of origin, but you know ahead of time, okay, these are the steps I'm going to need to take into place, both within the US theoretically, and then when I bring my child home with me, whether it is creating citizenship in your country of origin, things like passports, etc. So just knowing that beforehand and knowing how that's processed. I would say a unique challenge right now in the COVID world has really been travel. Many countries are restricting travel into the US. Out of the US, yes, but very frankly, more into the US. And so with COVID, there have been challenges in terms of intended parents who live in other countries to come here, or when they're here to leave and go back to their country. And so I think that is a piece right now that is new for all of us as we're trying to best navigate that part of it.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna hand it over to Sam to walk us through some tips for single queer men that are interested in pursuing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So single men are an important portion of the clients that we serve in any given year. So I didn't have a chance to pull the exact numbers before I jumped on this call, but I'd estimate we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40 single journeys going on right now for single queer men. And so it is a journey that we're used to navigating. That's both internationally and domestic. And so I think the important thing in this is, this is a complex process. It's also an emotional process. And there are points in the journey that nothing is guaranteed necessarily. And so an embryo transfer, for instance, might not have success. You heard me say earlier, kind of this 65% success rate. There's obviously 35% on the other hand that don't have a successful transfer. And those moments of, they're not failure, but they're moments, they're bumps in the road, I think, and they're kind of steps along the journey to parenthood, can be very stressful and very emotional. And so having someone in your life, a friend or a family member that understands what you're going through, is not necessarily part of the process with you, but is someone you talk to regularly, I think is really important. And identifying that person early on in the process, and engaging them in the process a little bit is equally important. Make sure it's not someone that works for you or something like that. We had one person that came through that identified his personal attorney as his support person, which is probably not the type of support you want. because you want someone that really can kind of jive with you emotionally on these things. There's some things that IVF clinics and surrogacy agencies can do to help limit the emotional impact of those bumps in the road. A lot of clinics have packages in which you pay for a multitude of transfers at a single time. I think FCI has a great package with that regard. Circle also has a package that's a fixed fee package, so that when that bump in the road does happen, you can really focus on processing it from an emotional standpoint rather than also worrying about the financial impacts. And then I think the other thing that's really nice is there are great networks out there of support groups. A lot of local LGBTQ centers have support groups. Circle, we run our own support groups for parents in our program, where you have a chance to connect with other parents who are going through this process and have a chance to just be a little bit raw and a little bit kind of emotional about what's happening. I think all of us want the same thing. Here, we all want to see you with a baby in your arms. And so anything we can do to help support you and get into that process, we love to do. So I think the last line on that is really the real key. The strong support network is absolutely essential to going through something like this. I don't know if this is me as well, but I'm happy to take it. We do run our own support groups for the single dads we have going through our process. That's actually one of the support groups that I participate in regularly as a dad through. I didn't go through surrogacy, but my wife and I went through IVF and struggled for a long time with it. So I'm familiar with a lot of the emotions that kind of come up in a journey like this. And then obviously, GWK has great groups as well on Facebook and other communities to connect.
Anything you'd add, Dr.?
Yeah, I would just add, I think most infertility centers we have psychologists on staff, and sometimes it's nice just to have that one-on-one conversation as you're building your support. I mean, the notion of the village starts very early, and it is identifying those key people in your life. And for many of us, it's hard to know that when you're walking into this, and so that's someone that can really help and guide you and to connect you to all of the different supports that exist, both potentially virtually as well as in person.
Great point. Great point.
Great, thank you both so much. So again, that was a very quick overview of the surrogacy journey and also some tips for single women to be thinking about if they're thinking about embarking on this journey on their own. So the rest of this webinar is going to be dedicated to Q&A. There really is no question too big or too small or too specific to your own instance. We're very excited to be offering this free resource for people to be getting this access to experts like these. So feel free, please, to use the Q&A function to ask the question publicly. You can also message me privately and using the chat feature if you prefer to do that. Or if you are tuning in via Facebook Live, you can message in the comments, and we'll, again, we're just going to go through as many of these as we can. Starting with this first one, which is a great one from Jacob, who's wondering how the process is impacted depending on the nationality of the parent. So this is for international intended parents. He, for instance, is from Mexico. Why don't we start with you, Sam, if you want to walk through how you approach international intended parents.
Yeah, great question. And about 40% of our clients come from outside the US. So this is an arena in which Circle has played for a long time with a lot of experience. There are a couple unique challenges for international parents as it relates to a surrogacy journey. The first I already touched on a little bit before in terms of there's an extra layer of legality that's necessary to make sure we're threading the right legal needles here to make sure we can put just your name on the birth certificate at the end of the journey. For instance, Germany is a country that often requires a surrogate in the US that is a single surrogate rather than a married surrogate. So there's all sorts of different complications like that, state by state, paired country by country. So that's primary complication number one. The secondary complication with international surrogacy really comes around just the general coordination of the journey. Now, you wouldn't really see this in Mexico given the time zones, but a lot of the international parents we support come from Europe or come from Australia and New Zealand. And obviously in both of those areas, we have a pretty substantial time zone difference. And so it affects the way we coordinate the case with parents in terms of when we meet with folks, and we have sometimes asked that you're a little bit flexible in your meeting times, and we try to be flexible in our business hours. so that we can find time to meet. But then it also plays a big role in your relationship with your carrier. I think intended parents that are international often find it a little bit harder to find a connection point with the carrier because of this vast time zone difference. And so what we really advocate for is, if you're in that situation, set a time once a week that you know you're going to connect. Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, which is 8 a.m. in Australia on Tuesday or something like that. I don't know wherever the right time zone is for you. And really hold to that time. Because our parents here domestically, they can text the surrogate during the day and find the time to connect on a very ad hoc basis. That's very difficult when you introduce kind of a 7 or 8 hour or greater time zone difference. And so I think it's one of those things that, with proper forethought, a little bit of rigor, it's pretty easy to navigate. And then the international journeys look extremely similar to our domestic journeys, but it requires a little bit more thought in terms of coordination. So.
Great, thank you. And how about from the fertility center side, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron?
I think sort of exactly what was suggested with coordination, so that the visit to our clinic is going to be the most efficient as possible. The initial discussions are done, which now seems so commonplace, but doing some component of telemedicine that we help for you to identify that egg donor. Again, theoretically, all of this can be remote, all of this can be electronic. And the visit you come in, that there is that sperm specimen that's created and frozen for future use, the blood work that's required at the FDA, everything occurs in that day. So it's the most efficient visit. I think some of the challenges can be, depending on the flexibility with travel, is if that visit, there would be, of course, a separate visit, the transfer would occur, which require either a second travel time or theoretically that transfer is done and the individual is being connected via FaceTime. I think in some ways, like I said, in terms of travel ease, COVID has made it challenging. What COVID has also done is sort of equalizing the fact that it is difficult for anyone besides that person getting medical treatment to be present now. And so FaceTiming other support has become so commonplace that maybe that's making it more acceptable or easier for those of us that are international. I think the real key piece is that we are very efficient with the visits that you come, and we know ahead of time the flexibility, as well as what was said, that the legal part is well delineated before any of this really starts. So it's very clear, not only in terms of the birth certificate within the US, but the pieces that may need to come into place to then get citizenship in your country of origin, passports, and things of that nature.
Let me just chime in with one more real quick. I think Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron, you mentioned a great point there around coronavirus. We as an agency, we have our lawyers in-house. We have not seen a big impact for international parents as it relates to surrogacy. We have had a tremendous amount of success allowing parents to come to the country to be here for the birth of their child and be with the surrogate at the time of birth. In the period where the country was in lockdown, which was late March, April, May, I think we had about 40 parents that had births that were international. I think 38 of them were here at the birth, and the other 2 arrived within a day or 2. And so there is a more complication as it relates to coronavirus, certainly, but travel in and out of the country is something that, at least for us as an agency, we've been able to navigate really well.
Sort of the national statistics had demonstrated that there were quite a few intended parents that were unable to be coming to the U.S. in that context in March and April. And yes, things have changed and it's feasible, but like anything else, planning for it and appreciate that's another element of a challenge is helpful to know ahead of time.
Absolutely. Okay, so this next question from John is also a really great one because I think it often surprises people to learn that if you are HIV positive, it is not a barrier anymore to becoming a biological parent without transmitting the virus. There's a process known as sperm washing, which Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron can walk us through a little bit about what is involved in that process. And John's also curious to know what the cost is.
So in the context of an individual who's HIV positive, there is usually one main clinic in Bedford is what they are called, and they provide this service. And so what they do now is there's various processes that can be done to assure that any HIV component, and the vast majority of individuals with HIV, the blood serum level, of course, is 0, but at the level of the sperm as well, that the washing had occurred. Usually what that involves is sort of providing your specimen to that clinic. Most IVF centers do not do in-house sperm processing. It really is sort of outsourced to sort of this one entity within the US that does such an effective job. And they freeze the sperm, and when it needs to be utilized, they are sending it to the clinic that you're using. So it potentially is adding one extra element. I apologize, I can follow up. I do not know that cost.
So I actually do think I should also just put a plug out there. In addition to all these webinars that we're going to be doing, we've released a whole series of curriculum and step-by-step instructions for people interested in surrogacy, which you can access at gayswithkids.com. I do think we have that number in there somewhere, so we will definitely follow up with you, John. But to remind me, please email us at dads@gayswithkids.com and we'll get you that figure. Sam, anything you'd say about any of your HIV positive patients that you work with?
Yeah, this is also, we probably have 15 or 20 journeys going on at the moment for HIV positive dads. Like Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron mentioned, we work with the lab in Bedford, and Dr. Kiesling is the director there, and she does a fantastic job and is great to work with. On the surrogacy side, the only complication, not really a complication, the only kind of nuance to it is we, of course, tell the surrogate about the fact that the embryo being transferred was created using this process, which is called the SPAR program, SPAR program. And so she will be aware. Usually the surrogate is compensated a little bit more due to that, even though the risk is essentially zero. I'm not sure it's absolute zero. And so she gets compensated a small amount for that. But from a surrogate screening perspective, we're quite good at finding surrogates that are willing to carry. Actually, the manager of our surrogate screening team is a former surrogate herself who carried for a SPAR couple. So she often talks to potential surrogates. And then her husband actually talks to potential surrogates' husbands who might be nervous about it as well. And so we've got a lot of really good, we've had a lot of success with that as well. So yeah, happy to answer more questions in a consult, obviously, but hopefully that helps, generally speaking.
Great. So hopefully that answered your question, John. Please, again, email us if it did not, dads@gayswithkids.com. Okay, so this is an interesting question from Corey. He's interested to know if there's a percentage of single men that give up on the process due to financial hardship, obviously because they're having to handle it on their own. And if so, if there's a certain stage in the process that people typically give up on more than any other. Why don't we start with you, Sam?
Sure. So this is a really good point to kind of draw a distinction between the two types of programs that you'll generally see if you start to look across a wide variety of surrogacy agencies. Most agencies have what we would call a variable price program, which is you will pay the agencies a set amount, and then you'll pay variable costs associated with the surrogate's travel, insurance, compensation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if she has a C-section or a miscarriage, the agency will come to you and say, okay, we need X number of dollars to continue on to compensate the surrogate. Circle, I think, is fairly unique in agency world in that we've said variable cost programs are really not conducive with great outcomes over a large population of people. And so all of our programs are fixed fee programs. You pay one fee and we will support you until you go home with a child, no matter how many transfers it takes, no matter how many surrogates it takes, no matter how many times she has to travel to the clinic. It doesn't matter. We just had a journey wrap up in August. That Circle went into our pocket for, I think, $85,000 so they could finish their journey. It was one of those kind of, they ran into a couple bumps in the road and the costs can stack up pretty fast. So for us, the number of parents that leave due to financial difficulties now that we've oriented towards all fixed fee programs is hopefully going to be zero unless they decide for some reason they just don't want to continue their journey. But we really are firm believers in fixed fee programs. I think variable cost programs are like buying a house in a floodplain and then not buying flood insurance. Bad things can happen on some of these journeys, and you want to make sure you're protected to get to the finish line. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, yeah. And how about you, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron?
I think agree. I think the key piece is that there are no surprises. So before you start any part of this process, it should be incredibly clear what the costs are. It should not feel like out of nowhere something started adding in. There are assured risk programs, whether it's with the egg donor bank, actually that's one of its advantages, or potentially within different centers or the surrogacy program, but it should be well described to you, both the egg donor, the IVF costs, the agency costs, and the gestational carrier costs before you even start, so that you would know that ahead of time and that you can plan for it. I think most fertility centers not only will discuss ways for sort of fixed cost or assured risk cost, but also different entities that exist, whether it's to obtain additional funding, loan-based programs, There's not many, but out there are a couple of nonprofits that individuals can apply for to also get grants that will not, of course, provide the entire cost, but can help. Within Illinois, I happen to be on the board of one called Chicago Coalition for Family Building, and we give these every single year. So I think there are entities that your clinic can help connect you with, but the key piece is that there's no surprises. You should know this before you start. It shouldn't happen midway.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just take a second to brag a little bit about our industry partners here, because again, there are, as you start to research fertility clinics and surrogacy agencies, you will find a ton of options. There's a lot of players in the field now. They're not all created equal. Some are much more upfront about their cost structure than others. And so the experts that we have chosen to work with, again, have been thoroughly vetted by Gays with Kids. A lot of queer men have gone through these programs and have reported back positive experiences. So this is a really critical part of your journey, is to make sure that you understand the cost well before you sign any contracts. And again, the experts that Gays with Kids has chosen to partner with here to bring you this information are very much in that field. Okay, so this next question is around, well, so I think this is a pretty simple answer, but Sam, Corey wants to know if any of the agencies use surrogates from different countries with intended parents living in the United States.
No, surrogacy outside the US often is probably not maybe as inspirational as I think surrogacy in the US can be. We really see great relationships form between parents and surrogates throughout their journey. And from what I've read and what I understand to be true, talking to other industry partners, is a lot of times surrogacy outside the US does not look that same way. It's a lot of pregnant women living in a dormitory together, carrying children for folks, and you might not know the surrogate or have a relationship with her in any way. So I don't think there's any agencies in the US that coordinate journeys outside the US. And I think how it unfolds is often a little bit different.
Great, thank you. If you have any other specific questions about that, Corey, please feel free to reach out at dads@gayswithkids.com or to re-ask the question here, because this is international surrogacy as a whole other topic that we plan to actually have a separate webinar on, so please stay tuned for that. Okay, so another question about costs. So do you have an estimate about how much it would, well, so this is an important question, just generally something we haven't touched on yet, but if you could both talk about the costs that are involved in a surrogacy journey from both of your perspectives, and also if there's any reason that it would be different for a single parent versus a couple. Why don't we keep it with you, Sam, first?
Yep, absolutely. So if you come to us and you just need a surrogate, you should orient around a cost of somewhere between $125,000 and $135,000, depending on what program you choose with Circle. That includes all your legal work, surrogate compensation, travel, agency fees, insurance, everything you need except for what happens at the IVF clinic. If you choose a donor through us, you should orient around $149,000 to $159,000. Again, that includes everything you need outside of what happens at the IVF clinic.
Great. And how about for the Fertility Center perspective, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron?
I mean, I would agree with exactly those numbers. If we think of a single IVF cycle, most are sort of committing to do multiple cycles, so some multiple cycle plan to do an IVF cycle. For egg donor to do an IVF cycle, potentially embryo testing is probably somewhere in the vicinity of $25,000 to plus $1,000, probably 25 to 35. There are some assured risk programs with the egg bank that we've partnered with. It can be sort of a little bit higher than that range as well, but it provides sort of a fixed number of tries, and if not successful, then part of that is gifted back. So that would be the one caveat. The majority of the cost, as Sam said well, is going to be oriented around the gestational carrier, the legal fees in that regard. And so I would completely agree with the costs that were provided.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to direct you to, we have a chapter in our curriculum that's dedicated to breaking down this cost, because I know when I first learned how expensive surrogacy was, it was pretty shocking, and I think it is for many people. But to really be able to break it down and understand where that money is going and why, I think is very helpful for every intended parent that's interested in going throughout this journey. That chapter also has several different suggestions for how you can offset the cost of surrogacy, including some grants and loans like Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron mentioned, different ways to break up your journey to make it a little bit more cost efficient. And we have a whole other webinar about that as well that you can access online. And we'll be repeating these webinars over the next several months too. So if you're interested in costs, what goes into the costs and ways to make it more affordable. Stay tuned for that as well. Hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, please again, feel free to re-ask it. Okay, so this is a question from Jeff, who's interested in elaborating on the pros of navigating surrogacy as a single queer man, as opposed to in a relationship. So I think maybe maybe the pros is not the right way to be framing this. But so I think the two kind of bullets that we included in the presentation were that there are more single gay men doing this, and that there's no need to wait. So I think just from my perspective, this is the no need to wait is, I think prior to surrogacy, this was, if you were interested in having your own biological child, it wasn't something you could easily just, manifest. so you don't have to wait to be in a committed relationship or a partnership in order to pursue this, that this is really something that single men are able to navigate on their own increasingly. But yeah, so let's get some more perspectives from our panelists. Has said any sort of pros or just ways to kind of reassure single queer men that are interested in pursuing surrogacy. Why don't we keep it with you first, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron?
I think exactly like you said, you don't have to wait to be in a committed relationship. This is something that you can do singly. I think, again, as has been discussed, in the sense of a community. So creating that support system, knowing just like before you come sign anything, you want to know cost from A to Z. You're going to want to know sorts of people with you on the journey, both within your fertility clinic and in the agency you choose, and in your family and in your friends, the people who are going to help to get through the process of delivery and beyond. And so I think, like anything else, we start with our village very, very early, but it's feasible to do, and that hopefully feels very empowering.
Great. Anything you add, Sam?
Yeah, I would say, if you're looking for kind of the pros of it, choosing an egg donor is a very difficult process. And I sometimes see couples that create their own lists of their top 10 donors, and there's no overlap between the top 10 donors. And if you're a single guy, you don't have to worry about that. You get to pick the person that's perfect for you, for your donor, and with your surrogate as well. It's less of a concern on the surrogate side. I see it more on the donor side, but I think that's a big pro.
Great. Thank you both. Hopefully that answered your question, Jeff. Okay, so we have another question. Is it possible to complete the sperm freeze in a home country, so outside of the US, like the United Kingdom, rather than having to travel to the US during COVID restrictions to complete that process? Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron.
I would say that it's technically feasible. It is a little bit unnerving to freeze eggs or sperm and transport internationally. There's been enough incidents at customs an incidental thaw. So usually it's not recommended. I would say in addition to providing the sperm freeze, there are on-site sort of FDA labs that will be required that would be difficult to do outside the US. So at least one visit to the US, I think, is going to be required. The goal is that it is as efficient as a visit as possible. I think it's going to be difficult to avoid any visits to the US, so that sperm freeze can be done there in the context of all these other things that are being done.
Great. Okay, so that we've gotten through our Q&A portion. I'm going to go to some of the private questions I've gotten. But again, if there are still follow-up questions anyone has that people want to ask publicly, feel free to use the Q&A feature. So we had a question that wanted both of you to elaborate just a little bit more on the precautions that you're taking during COVID, during this moment, and if there's any reason that people should postpone thinking about pursuing a surrogacy journey right now, given that context. Sam, if you want to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have layered on additional screening for our surrogates coming through our program, a lot more around the stability of their lives and their work life or their partner's work life, just given how destabilizing COVID has been for many folks, and also an increased element of what's your kind of sense of maturity around this pandemic, in that can we trust you to get tested, trust you to travel to the clinic back and forth, and whatnot. So we've certainly changed the way we do things a little bit. I think for most of the people on this webinar, who I'm assuming by and large have not started their journey yet, I actually think you probably are not going to see overall a big impact from coronavirus. As I said, if you signed on today, you're probably about 5 months away from matching with a surrogate, another 3 months after that away from doing an embryo transfer itself, and then 9 months away from that to have the birth of your child. So certainly I think from everything that I read, I would expect we'll see a vaccine somewhere in the field sometime next year that hopefully receives quick widespread adoption. And so I think, if you believe that to be the case and you bump that up against the timelines I've talked about here, you might see some impact around your surrogate traveling to do the embryo transfer itself, but that's pretty easy stuff. And I think actually the risk to the journey overall is kind of quite low. If we think about being a baby born 18 months from now, I think everything will hopefully be relatively stable and back to normal.
And just a quick follow-up on the surrogacy agency perspective, they're curious to know if this has impacted the pool of available surrogates or women that are interested in working with you during this time.
Yeah, it has. So when the year started, with our screening criteria, we were running match times probably in the 3 to 4 month range. In that March, April, May, and June, July timeframe, we did see fewer suitable care. We saw a similar number of applications, but much fewer women that were actually suitable for the process, vis-a-vis everything that was going on in the world. We've since seen in September and October a nice kind of ramp back up in the suitability of the applicants we've had coming through. And so my hope is that as we get into 2021 and beyond, we'll start to see our match times go from that 5 or 6 month range back down to that 3 month range or so. But right now, I'd like to be conservative.
Great. And how about from the fertility center side?
So it has, we've overhauled in many, many ways our day-to-day, because our goal is to keep anyone who comes into our entity as safe as possible. And so we are screening all individuals doing treatment. We're regularly screening our staff. We've implemented the things that even seem silly to mention in terms of social distancing and masks. But the gestational carrier would be screened even prior to the transfer. The theoretical negative is we're trying to screen within a week of a transfer. So if unexpectedly the gestational carrier screens positive, we will cancel the transfer. And we do believe that is what you would want. The data of COVID and pregnancy is still really being established. It is not felt as of now to create birth defects, but there are some concerns about maternal health and individuals who are pregnant having higher complication risk if they get COVID of hospitalizations and intubations, which ultimately clearly can have challenges for the pregnancy. So we are restricting in that way. We are screening more, I'll be very frank, asymptomatic positive across the board, but that is different. I think the hope is that 9 months from now that things will be different. I will be very candid though, there are 0 vaccine trials right now that include pregnant women. So the idea that the gestational carrier will be able to take a vaccine is, I think, not realistic 9 months from today. The goal for individuals who are pregnant is that enough of the community is immune that they will benefit from that sort of herd immunity approach. But I think we still are exploring how it can impact pregnancy. I do think, though, that we are all back up and running. There was a stopping point for many fertility clinics in March and April, a hard stop created by American Society of Reproductive Medicine that most of us are not planning to redo or believe it is needed because we've gotten a little smarter, both the medical community overall, about how COVID is both diagnosed and treated, and also about how we can implement pieces to keep our clinics safe. So the one thing that I think is a positive is there should not be a hard stop. That it won't be in our world in 9 months. I hope that's the case. I think it's unlikely, but I think hopefully enough of the community will be protected that potential pregnancy risks. But it is just the way all of us are living our lives is the way the gestation carrier will live her life. And we'll be screening people that follow that, right? That you want someone who is respectful and mindful enough that they're going to be avoiding large spaces and doing all the measures that we're all doing to avoid exposure.
Great point about vaccines for pregnant women. That's, I think, really a good point.
Okay, great. So in the 2 minutes we have remaining, so I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all of the private questions. But again, please email me at dads@gayswithkids.com and we will make sure that one of our experts gets back to you with the full response to your question. But I can't thank our panelists enough, and I want to give you both just an opportunity to sign off and say a little bit about how people can get in touch with you if they're interested in following up with questions or to work with you. Why don't we go ahead, Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron.
Yes, please. You can find us online, fcionline.com. Also, our Instagram handle at Fertility Centers of Illinois. My Instagram handle, you can DM me anytime at dr.jennyhirshfeld.
Great. And Sam?
Yep. Thanks so much for having us here today. Dr. Hirshfeld-Cytron, it was great to spend some time together as well. Circlesurrogacy.com is the easiest way to get a hold of us. And if you want to email me directly, you can email me at shyde@circlesurrogacy.com. Unfortunately, I don't have a social media handle, but hopefully email will work. So.
Great. And again, I'm David Dodge. I'm the executive editor of Gays with Kids. This has been our, I think, 6th in a series of webinars that we've been putting out around the topic of surrogacy and IVF, which again, we're very excited to be sharing with our community for free. Again, we will have these happening on a weekly basis. If you're interested in other Path to Parenthood series, we're also doing one around adoption and foster care. So please go to gayswithkids.com and look at our events scheduled for upcoming webinars that might be of interest to you. And please also do check out our new curriculum series, which we're adding to and rolling out more and more resources every week, which we're very excited to be doing. And if you have any comments on these new resources or ways that you think we could be improving them, we're very eager to hear those. So please do check us out online and on our Instagram, which is Gays with Kids with underscores in between the words. Thank you again, and hope to see you all soon. And thank you again to our panelists.